Today was the hottest day in Louisville. It's going to be 93 degrees today. So you come into Angel's Envy, it's wonderfully climate controlled, nice and cool. It's a great escape from that heat outside. Late June, getting ready to be July.
How are we doing today, everybody? I appreciate you asking, but folks, that was the energy I've had on my 10:30 tour this morning. We're gonna run that back one more time. Friends, how are you doing today? Good. That's more like it. Folks, welcome into Angel's Envy. My name is Kelsey, and I'm going to be your Distillery Guardian, taking you through your tour experience this afternoon. So, folks, we're ready to learn about bourbon. Yeah. Are we ready to drink some bourbon? Yeah. There we go. Guys, I'll tell you, we'll go ahead and get started because the quicker I get through this stuff, the quicker I'm going to get some of that good stuff in your hands. So, folks, we're going to start by talking about these two gentlemen right here on the wall behind me. And this is the likeness of Lincoln and Wes Henderson. They're the co-founders of Angel's Envy, but also the father and son bourbon dream team. And I'll tell you, before starting with Angel's Envy, Lincoln in particular already had a pretty prominent career within the bourbon industry. He was employed by Brown-Forman for nearly 40 years. Now, is everybody here familiar with what Brown-Forman is? Season yes and some no's, usually a mix to that question. So I'll tell you, if you don't know about that name, guys, Brown-Forman is one of the largest spirit conglomerates in the world. For example, they own Jack Daniels, Old Forester, right down the street here from us, as well as countless others. And with Lincoln's time at Brown-Forman, he was the mastermind behind three iconic products that I'm sure you've heard of. Those are going to include Gentleman Jack, Jack Daniel's Single Barrel Collection, and a little-known distillery that sits about an hour away from us here in Louisville, in Woodford County, Kentucky. Any guesses as to which one I'm talking about? How'd you guess? Absolutely. And folks, I'll tell you, his impressive accomplishments don't end there, because Lincoln was also a part of the inaugural class of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame down in Bardstown, Kentucky, and would eventually win a Lifetime Achievement Award. Pretty impressive, right? So, folks, what is there left for a man to do after getting all those impressive accomplishments but to take a well-deserved retirement, which is exactly what Lincoln did. But thankfully for us, his son Wes had other plans, because he knew his dad about a year into that retirement, knowing that he was still sitting on some bourbon ideas, and that Wes himself had 6 sons. So they decided they were all going to come together to create a family legacy. And friends, the distillery that you are in today is the fruition of that family legacy. Getting started all the way back in 2006 with the founding of our LLC, which is Louisville Distilling Company. And then in 2011 is when we're going to have the very first bottle of Angel's Envy bourbon being bottled. Now, all that to say, that is just a brief overview of the beginning of our history here at Angel's Envy. And the next thing we're going to go over is that information on the other side of the wall. But before we dive into it, folks, is this anybody's very first time on a bourbon distillery tour?
Oh.
Perfect. Friends, I'll tell you, I asked that question because I'm going to try to get us all on an even playing field before we get into that distillery and start going through every step of this whole process. So that means we're going to take a second to talk a little bit more about bourbon in general. So what do you got to do to make a bourbon? And that is following all 7 of these bourbon laws. Now, here at Angel's Envy, we're going to call these the bourbon ABCs, guys. And we'll start with that very first one, which is where bourbon can be made. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you've already got some bourbon knowledge or fairly decent eyesight, can anybody tell me where you can make bourbon? Like you read about the wall somewhere? Absolutely. Folks, bourbon is American made, which means you can make it anywhere in the United States. Bourbon is actually America's only native spirit, and it has been that way since 1964 with the signing of the Native Spirits Act. Now, I do also like to point out with this one that although you can make bourbon anywhere in the U.S., 95% of all that good stuff out there still coming from right here in the Bluegrass State, which I would say is a contributor to that common misconception that you can only make it right here in the state of Kentucky. Now, guys, the next one that we'll go over says brand new, and this is in regards to how we age that bourbon. So by law, bourbon's got to be aged in brand new, charred oak vessels. And of course, our vessel of choice here at Angel's Envy, just like every other bourbon distillery out there, folks, is going to be those barrels. And more specifically, American white oak barrels are the ones that we're going to be using here. Now the next one, coolest name out of all 7 of the bourbon laws, and I gotta say the most widely known. So friends, does anybody know what our corn law is?
51.
At least one person in every group has it, absolutely. Folks, that corn law states that when it comes to that mash bill, or the different combination of grains that we use to start the bourbon journey, gotta be at least 51% or a majority corn, no matter what combination of grains that you're using. Absolutely. Now for the next 3, guys, we'll go over these all together because these are going to be our proofing laws. Now the very first one says that you can't distill bourbon above 160 proof. The second is that you cannot move it into one of those brand new charred oak barrels above 125 proof. And then we got the third one, which I got to tell you is my personal favorite of these proofing laws. And it says that once bourbon goes into its bottle, it's got to be at least 80 proof. Now for that last one, folks, this one is super important. That genuine law states that there are 0 artificial colors and 0 artificial flavors added into your bourbon. Does anybody know the only thing that you can legally mix in there? Water, H2O, and that is going to be it. Now, friends, now that we got through all the proofing or all of those bourbon laws, last thing I'll direct your attention to on this wall, I promise, is that word up there in the top right-hand corner. And we're going to take a quick second to talk about finishing, because that is what makes us nice and special here at Angel's Envy. Now, folks, I'll tell you, for most other bourbon distilleries, they're going to take that liquid out of one of these brand new charred oak barrels here, filter it to make sure it's nice and clean, and then send that off to their bottling line. Here at Angel's Envy, we're going to take that bourbon and filter it, and then move it into one of those guys there. And both that second barrel is a ruby port wine barrel, straight from the Douro Valleys in Portugal. Ooh. Ah. Very fancy, right? So guys, the bourbon gets to sit in the second fancy barrel for an additional time, where now it's going to get the chance to soak up some of that color, but more importantly, a lot of that flavor from the wine that's there before it is. Good news. Folks, we just made it through history, bourbon laws, and of course what makes us nice and special. Who's ready to get into that distillery? Here we are. Now, say it is a fully functioning distillery that we're about to head into, friends. So can anybody guess the last thing I'm going to go over before we do so?
Don't be lighting those cigarettes.
That's one of them. Absolutely. Folks, just a couple of quick safety things, I promise. First of those is when we get inside, guys, on the first level of the distillery, you're going to see some tape lines on the floor. No matter what color, we're going to ask that you stay within those lines because they are specifically there for our safety. The second is that there's going to be some CO2 in the air from the fermentation process. So on the off chance that you start to not feel great as we're walking around, again, my name is Kelsey. Please holler out at me, and I'll make sure to take you somewhere that you're going to feel better. Now, with that CO2, folks, there's alcohol present in the air as well. So this one is the most important. Everybody got their listening ears on. Breathe deep. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it is the only free alcohol that you are getting out of us today. Now, corny jokes aside, friends, that is also going to be no lighters, no smoking, no vaping, and oddly enough, no flash photography. So take as many photos and videos as you want, guys. The only thing he asks is the flash is turned off while you do so. Now, this very last one should go without saying, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. Some of the stuff in that distillery is incredibly hot. Some is incredibly cold. And I would rather you find folks not figure out which is which by putting your hand on something. Because let me tell you, it is not going to be a fun way to learn the difference. So a good rule of thumb is if you see me touching it, I know it's safe, so you're more than welcome to touch it as well. But if you don't see me touching it, what are we going to do? Hands off. Keep on looking at it, absolutely. Now, guys, that's all the safety things I've got. You ready to get in there?
Yeah.
All right. One of our 8 fermentation tanks that we've got here at Angel's Envy. Here in just a second, I'm going to pop this guy open. And you're more than welcome to come as close as you want to take a look inside. But I got 2 quick warnings. First of those is, like I mentioned in the rotunda, CO2 is a byproduct of this reaction. So if you get real close to it, it might tickle your eyes and your nose just a tad. And I wanted to let you know that's exactly what that is. The second is that if you got glasses on your face, on the top of your head, on the front of your shirt, hold on tight to them. Because if they go in this tank, they now belong to the tank. Because, folks, each one of these can hold 13,565 gallons of mash. These tanks are absolutely massive. But, folks, once we get this big old tank full of that mash, we're going to add about 40 pounds of yeast into the top of each one of them. Stir it up real good to make sure it's nice and evenly distributed. And then after that, it is going to be a pretty hands-off process. That yeast is going to do all the hard work for us.
Look, we're having a party in there.
What was it?
We're having a party.
They absolutely are. Best kind of party, one that involves alcohol. Now, friends, I'll tell you, as that yeast is eating away at those simple sugars that I mentioned were created during the cooking process, we're going to have 3 byproducts. Any guesses as to what the most important of those is going to be? Alcohol, absolutely. And by the time it's finished, which takes about 70 hours or 3 days in total, we're going to have 9 to 10% alcohol distiller's beer. Now, once it's done, guys, we're going to move that distiller's beer into one final tank, which is our beer well. And that guy is basically just a holding tank for it before it heads off to its next stop. And here in a second, friends, I'm going to take you over to get a peek inside that beer well. But before we do, anybody ready to start drinking? Let's do it. Folks, if you want to try the mash right from this fermenter, raise your hand for me and I'll pour up enough for everyone who does. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, give me just a second, guys.
It's going to be gross.
It's going to taste a little bit like oatmeal. I don't think anybody likes oatmeal. Yeah?
Folks, if you hear that beeping on my hip, that is just my LEL meter letting me know that it's working the way it's supposed to and CO2 is coming out of this tank. Here we go. Absolutely. There we go, friends. There we go. Absolutely.
No, yeah, it's big. It's like this.
How do you feel about it?
Oatmeal. I should make oatmeal like this.
Friend, I'll tell you that's because this is a relatively new batch, so a lot of those simple sugars haven't been eaten away by that yeast just yet. But it might not be the best thing you've ever tried, but certainly not the worst, right?
Lunch.
There is not. That is just that yeast doing its job.
Right.
Alrighty, well, I'm trying that delicious distiller's beer, which I promise gets a lot better by the end of this process. Folks, are you ready to head over to that beer well? Alrighty. Right this way, guys.
Vegas Union been here in 1986, and that is the all section was down below. These things are abandoned
Oh, now, folks, we have just recently emptied out this beer well, so you're going to be able to see just how massive these tanks are. But guys, I'm going to get this door popped open for you here. Feel free to come through and take a peek inside. And you're looking at items on this Alrighty, gang, welcome into, as I'm sure you can imagine, our still room, where in my opinion the magic really starts to happen. So folks, from that beer well outside, we are pumping about 30 gallons a minute of that distiller's beer out of that tank and into this room. Now here at Angel's Envy, we're going to run that distiller's beer through 2 rounds of distillation. And the first of those is going to take place in our 35-foot tall copper column still. So guys, as that distiller's beer trickles down on the inside of this column, we're going to be pumping hot steam up from the bottom. Now that hot steam is what's going to separate the alcohol from the water and grain in that distiller's beer. So after we got that separated, guys, we're going to have 124 proof low wine. But like I mentioned, we're not stopping there. Guys, we're going to send that low wine directly underneath my feet from this room to our copper pot still, or our doubler. Now that guy is going to take care of that second round of distillation for us. That way we can make sure to get all of the impurities out of this distillate. And also hike up the fruit the tab. Because once we get it off that pot still, folks, we got this good stuff right here. Anybody happen to know what this is?
White Dog.
White Dog, White Lightning, Mountain Dew, Moonshine, Hillbilly Love Juice, High Wine. The list of nicknames goes on and on. But here at Angel's Envy, we're going to call it New Make. And friends, this new make here is coming in at 138 proof. It is nice and hot. And I'll tell you, there's a ton of good things that you can do with it. For example, we clean the windows with it. Wipe down the countertops with it. I'm personally going to clean our tasting table with this good stuff whenever our tour is over today, guys. But the most important thing that we do with it is introducing it to those brand new charred oak barrels. So friends, are we ready to leave the hottest room on this tour and head down to barrel fill? Yeah. Beautiful. All right, folks, welcome over to the first stop in the bourbon journey, which is, of course, talking about these grains that we're using. So, guys, here at Angel's Envy, our mash bill is comprised of 72% corn, 18% rye, and 10% malted barley. And before we can cook up any of these grains, we've got to send them to a specific place, which is our hammer mill, located right outside these windows here. Now, friends, I'll tell you, that hammer mill is incredibly loud. And believe it or not, one of the most dangerous steps of this entire process. So unfortunately, we don't get the chance to take you out there and see it personally. But we do have the next best thing, which is, of course, a picture up on the wall. And the way that that hammer mill works is all that grain is fed in through the top, and then on the inside, there's a rotor with 3 swinging hammers. So as that hammer mill spins, it's going to pulverize that grain for us, getting it down to about the consistency of cornmeal, so like a rough chop on it. And then after that, guys, those grains are coming directly into this room right behind you. So if you look right this way, folks, you're going to see where it's labeled our grain chute. And that is going to drop all those grains directly into our grain cooker. Now, importantly, for cooking all these grains, guys, we're adding each one of them in there individually because they all have to cook at different temperatures. So first, we're going to get that corn in there at about 210 degrees. And then the next grain that's going in is going to be the rye or our spice grain, but not before we let that temperature drop to about 170. Because guys, if you cook rye at too high of a temperature, it likes to think you're making bread. And it's going to clump together and make dough balls inside of that grain cooker, which is, I'm sure we can all imagine. It's not great for making bourbon. It just makes a huge mess. So we let that temperature drop just a tad, that way that doesn't happen on us. Now, of course, the third one and final one is going to be that malted barley, guys, going in at about 150 degrees. Now, that second drop in temperature is incredibly important because that allows us to hold on to some enzymes that we get from that grain. Those are going to be alpha and beta amylase enzymes, which are there to help us in the process of breaking down all of this starch over into simple sugar, which is incredibly important for the next step in our process. And speaking of, folks, we ready to head over and explore the wonders of fermentation? Alrighty. Well, folks, if we are ready to head that way, I'll guide you down the same side that we just walked up, and we're going to stop in one of our 8 fermentation tanks. So do you see? Oh, yeah. The drummer down there. All righty, everybody, go to the Distillery. Farmers out here to make me second with the comments are right upstairs. About 30 more upstairs, and then I count them every single day. And since we are going to hit them a couple of times to and from, I'd like to ask if anybody would prefer the elevator as opposed to those stairs for any reason whatsoever. Everybody good with working out for their bourbon? My kind of people. Folks, follow me right this way. We will hit those stairs and head on up. Yet again, I'm sure you can guess exactly what we're doing in here, which is dumping out barrels. Absolutely. Now, guys, that process is going to take place on this stainless steel trough that we have got on the right-hand side of the room. Now, folks, on the inside of that trough, what you can actually see are the pieces that have been taken out to be cleaned. That's going to be a mesh metal screen. And that's in there because as that bourbon flows through it, it's going to catch any large piece of char that might have flaked off from the inside of that barrel over that 4 to 6 years of aging. Now, we are also going to run it through a bag filter at the front of that trough, which means that we're filtering that bourbon 2 times coming out of that brand new charred oak barrel. And folks, we make sure to do that, because if we didn't, this is what your bourbon would look like. Gross, right? Friends, we call this a Kentucky snow globe. Looks pretty cool, but let me tell you, it tastes a whole lot less cool. I have tried that unfiltered bourbon. And if there's one characteristic I don't ever look for in a glass of bourbon, it's grit. It is not good. So we make sure to filter that bourbon for you. You are incredibly welcome. But after we got it filtered 2 times, guys, this is where we're going to introduce it to those ruby port wine finishing barrels. And once it goes into one of those, folks, there is actually two different journeys that bourbon can take. The first of those is going to be sitting in that port wine barrel for about 3 to 6 months. And that liquid is what is going to end up being our flagship Angel's Envy bourbon. Now the other, folks, is going to be our private select single barrel bourbon. And I'll tell you that those barrels are chosen because they have a perfect flavor profile all on their own. So we don't want to blend that with 30 to 60 other barrels like we usually do and lose that unique flavor. So we deem them as honey barrels. And folks, those honey barrels can sit in that port wine for 3 months to an entire year. So you can imagine that color, aroma, and delicious flavor that bourbon is going to pull from that time spent in that port wine barrel. Now, guys, once we get through that dumping process, transferring it into those port wine barrels, and then bringing it back here one last time, the filtration step that we're going to send that bourbon through to make sure it's nice and clean is going to be diatomaceous earth and active carbon filters. And I'll tell you, we prefer those, guys, because they allow us to hold on to a lot of those good fats and oils from the grains that we start with. So not only is that going to equate to more delicious aroma and flavor, but it is also going to lend itself to a buttery, almost silky mouthfeel to our bourbon, which, at least in my opinion, makes none of our products drink as hot as it says on that bottle. Now, speaking of bottle, folks, I'll tell you that bottling is going to be the last stop on the bourbon journey here under this roof. And if you look through this room right here, across through those windows on the other side, guys, that line is specifically for bottling that private select single barrel bourbon. Now, on that line, we're doing it all by hand. So from rinsing out those bottles, to filling those bottles, to decorating them with all those beautiful stickers that go on the front of them. Guys, it is all done by hand by an Angel's Envy employee. And those employees can get through about 2 or 3 barrels a day, which doesn't sound wildly impressive until you realize that there is anywhere from 250 to 275 bottles per barrel. So for being all hand done, it is incredibly impressive on that single barrel line. Now for our other products, if you haven't noticed, we got a whole other bottling line, and that one we're going to head back out and talk about for a few minutes. So friends, are we ready to head out and chat about it?
Where does the bourbon go after the finishing? I mean, put it in the finishing because it'll go back to the rick house?
Absolutely. So we fill those here, ship them off, bring them back, dump and transfer, ship it back out, and then bring it back here one last time. Sounds like a lot. Alrighty. So guys, now that we have made it back down the stairs, here in just a second, I'm going to guide you to the back of our facility towards production. But this is just a quick reminder to pay attention to those lines on the floor for me. And also a heads up that in the next room we're heading to, folks, there's a chance we could be within touching distance of some barrels. And if we are, I know it's going to be real tempting to touch them or to lean on them. But unless you'd like to take a big old Angel's Envy splinter as a souvenir home with you, I would recommend looking at those and not touching them, okay? Perfect. Folks, we'll head right that way. You got to go right this way. Hi, guys. Alrighty, now folks, I'll tell you, you can come as far into this room as you would like, all the way up to that green line here on the floor. we got someone coming in right behind you, hun. Alrighty, everybody, welcome into the barrel fill room. Any guesses as to what we're doing in here? Now, I'll tell you that is a very good guess, and we're going to get there in just a second. But folks, there is one important thing that we have to do before we can put it into those barrels. And that's going to put that new made into these two tanks right here behind me, where we're going to mix the only thing that you can add to your bourbon, which is... Any guesses as to what kind of water we're using?
Limestone filtered water.
Limestone filtered, which is going to equate to Louisville City tap water the entire way through this process, believe it or not. And folks, even though we have got one of the highest rated tap waters in the country, thanks to that natural limestone aquifer, if you look on this pipe behind me where it says RO, we are still going to run that through reverse osmosis. Make sure it is nice and clean before we mix it in there. And guys, the whole reason that we do that is to bring that proof down of the new make from 138 to 124.8, right below that 125 that it's got to be at before we can put it into one of those barrels. And as I'm sure you can guess, guys, that is the last thing to do with it at this station right here in the corner. Now, folks, this is our barrel fill station, where by hand, one at a time, we're going to fill about 120 barrels a day. And I'll tell you, once we got one of them full, folks, they are unbelievably heavy. So we're not going to pick them up and move them anywhere. We leave them on their side from that fill station, roll them out this bay door here, and immediately into the back of a semi-truck, where once we've got one even layer of about 63 or 64 barrels in there, we're going to ship them about an hour away from us to one of our 4 rig houses out in Henry County. Now, once we've got that barrel tucked into that brick house, folks, it's going to sit there for 4 to 6 years before it makes the journey right back here to us. Now, the next stop on the barrel's journey, and oddly enough, the next one on ours, folks, is going to be the barrel dump room. So are we ready to head to the best smelling room in the house? Beautiful. Guys, I'm going to guide you through the same door that we just came through. We'll cut across the bottling and then back a little farther into the facility. Folks, now, like I mentioned, the last stop in the bourbon journey, which is our brand spanking new bottling line. Now, guys, I'll tell you, this new line here is incredibly impressive. But to understand how impressive, I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory. When we got started, folks, our original bottling line was maybe a fourth of the size of this one here. When we started out doing the labeling for every single one of those bottles by hand. Now, doing it that way, we were sitting at about 15,000 bottles a day. And then once we got an automatic labeler in here to help, it shot it up to about 24,000 bottles a day. But this baby here behind me is putting out about 60 bottles a minute, which is going to equate to 54,000 bottles a day for a 2 8-hour shift, Monday through Friday, which we think is pretty darn impressive. Folks, we have more than doubled that bottling capacity with this new line, which I'll tell you that we absolutely need to do to keep up with you folks. Now, guys, once the bottle comes off this line, it's going to go on one final journey that is hopefully going to end up on your old bar at home. But I got good news. If you got a bottle of that good stuff on your bar at home already, we're not going to make you go all the way back there to drink it. If I'm not mistaken, we got some waiting for us upstairs in our nicely air-conditioned private tasting room. So, guys, we ready to head up and sample some of this good stuff? Anybody opposed? Great. We'd be having a whole other conversation if you did. Guys, I'm going to guide you back across that distillery one more time. We'll hit the stairs one more time, and then I'll guide you into that tasting room, all right? Right this way.